Mark Reynolds sat at the edge of the bed, his eyes fixated on the bank statement that had arrived earlier that morning. The figures were a harsh reminder that he was running out of time and running out of options. $38. That was all that remained in his account after rent, bills, and what little he could scrape together to buy enough food to last the week. His stomach clenched as he thought about the stack of overdue notices sitting on the kitchen counter, their edges curling with neglect. It wasn't the first time Mark had stared down an empty account, but this time felt different. The weight of the situation pressed harder than ever before, suffocating him with its urgency. His son Eli sat quietly at the kitchen table, eating a bowl of cereal. Eli was only 10, yet he'd learned the quiet art of survival all too soon. Mark could see it in his son's eyes, the unspoken worry that seemed to grow with each passing day. Eli had asked the same question yesterday, and Mark knew it would come again today. "When are we going to have a real home, Dad?" Mark glanced at his son, forcing a smile, but the truth hung heavily in the air between them. "Soon, buddy," he said, his voice a little too steady. "We'll get there. We just need to keep pushing through." But Mark wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the charade. They had bounced from one cramped apartment to another, never staying long enough to put down roots. For Eli, the question wasn't just about a roof over his head. It was about stability. A place that wasn't a temporary stop. A home. Mark ran his hand through his hair, his mind racing through every possible option. The bills, the rent, the car that barely started every morning. It was all too much. And yet, here he was, at a loss for what to do next. His heart tightened as he glanced at the empty wallet sitting on the table next to his coffee cup. He could almost hear the sound of the clock ticking, each passing second pushing him closer to the breaking point. That was when the ad caught his eye. It wasn't much, just a small listing buried at the bottom of a local newspaper. County tax auction. Properties sold for unpaid taxes. One cabin. $5. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The description was sparse, barely mentioning anything about the cabin other than its condition. Severely damaged, no utilities, accessible only by a dirt road. Mark didn't need to read the fine print to know that most people would see it as a lost cause. But to him, it wasn't just an old, run-down property. It was an opportunity. Maybe it wasn't the fresh start he had imagined for himself and Eli, but it was a chance. And that was all Mark needed. Just one chance to change their lives. He grabbed the newspaper and stared at the listing for a few moments longer, his mind working quickly. His thoughts swirled, weighed down by the gravity of the decision. What did he have to lose? A few dollars? His last bit of savings? That was nothing compared to the possibility of a future where Eli had a real home, a place to build a life. Mark couldn't afford to be picky. He couldn't afford anything else. Mark's pulse quickened as he grabbed the phone. There was no time to waste. If this cabin could be the answer to their prayers, he had to act fast. He dialed the number for the auction office, his hands slightly shaking as he waited for the line to connect. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered. "County Auction Office. How may I assist you?" "I'm calling about the cabin listed for $5, Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'd like to place a bid." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure? It's in pretty bad shape. No utilities, no road access. It's going to be a lot of work." "I understand," Mark replied, "but I'm willing to take a shot." "How do I place a bid?" The woman gave him the details, the time and location of the auction, the terms of the sale, and a brief rundown of the process. Mark nodded as he jotted everything down. The excitement was bubbling inside him, but there was a cold, sinking feeling in his stomach too. Was he really about to stake everything on this one chance? That evening, Mark sat on the edge of his bed, the auction documents spread out in front of him. Eli had gone to bed early, as usual, unaware of the tightrope his father was walking. He was just a boy, after all, innocent and full of dreams of a better life. He spent hours drawing pictures of the perfect home. Big yards, spacious rooms, a treehouse. It was painful for Mark to watch sometimes, knowing he could never give Eli any of that. Not with the way things were going. Mark's eyes drifted to the drawing Eli had made earlier in the day. It showed a house with a large yard, a tire swing hanging from a tree, and two people, father and son, standing side by side in front of it. Mark's heart tightened as he thought about his son's quiet hope. Maybe this auction could be the start of something better, he thought. But as he stared at the drawing, he knew there was more at stake than just a house. If this gamble didn't pay off, they could lose everything. No more chances. No more hope. Mark didn't know if he was strong enough to handle that. The next morning, Mark woke early, the dark sky still clinging to the horizon as he drove Eli to school. The entire drive his mind raced, but his exterior remained calm. Eli chattered away, talking about a school project and asking if they could go to the park later. Mark listened, but his thoughts kept returning to the auction. He had already made up his mind. This was it. He was bidding on that cabin. As they pulled into the school parking lot, Eli turned to him with a smile. "Do you think we'll get a real house soon, Dad?" Mark forced a smile, fighting the lump in his throat. "We'll get there, buddy. I promise. Just a little longer." Eli nodded, his trust unwavering. As Mark watched his son walk toward the school doors, the weight of the decision pressed down on him again. There was no turning back now. The auction was only hours away, and Mark knew that everything was about to change. He could feel the tension coiling in his chest, each breath shallow and quick. The uncertainty was suffocating, but with it, there was also a glimmer of hope. Mark wasn't just bidding on a cabin, he was bidding on a future, a new beginning. He had one shot, and it all came down to this. Mark Reynolds gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white from the tension, as the truck bounced along the dirt road. The journey had taken longer than expected, the winding, rugged path leading them deeper into the woods with each turn. The sky was overcast, thick with the promise of rain, but for Mark, the weather was the least of his concerns. It was the cabin, the $5 cabin, that consumed his thoughts. Beside him, Eli stared out the window, his face pressed against the glass, peering at the trees and the sparse underbrush that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Mark had told him about the cabin, about the hope he felt when he placed that bid. But deep down, he wasn't sure what kind of home they would find. The road had been long, and the uncertainty was starting to gnaw at him. "I can't believe we're really doing this, Dad," Eli said quietly, his voice breaking the silence that had settled between them since they'd left town. Mark glanced at his son. The words were innocent enough, but they hung in the air like an unspoken question. Eli was both excited and unsure, just like him. Mark smiled, but it felt more like a reflex than genuine reassurance. "It'll be all right, buddy. It's just a place," Mark said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We'll fix it up. You'll see." Eli nodded, but Mark could see the skepticism in his son's eyes. They had no idea what they were walking into. The truck hit a particularly rough patch of road, sending a jolt through both of them. Mark swerved slightly to avoid a deep rut, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He had to keep going. There was no turning back now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin, and the shape of the cabin emerged from the dense foliage. It was almost hidden by the overgrown vines that had begun to claim it as their own. But there it was, a broken-down structure that barely resembled a home. Mark's stomach tightened as they slowed to a stop, the tires grinding to a halt on the uneven ground. Eli didn't speak for a moment. He just stared at the cabin, his mouth slightly agape. Mark's heart sank as he took in the sight. The roof sagged in places, and several of the windows had long since shattered. The wooden beams that had once supported the structure were now warped and brittle. The entire place looked like it had been abandoned for years. "Well," Mark muttered, trying to shake off the disappointment creeping in. "It's not much to look at, but it's a start." Eli glanced up at him. "Do you think we can fix it, Dad?" Mark exhaled slowly, trying to muster some optimism. "Of course we can. It's just a place. We'll make it work." He could hear his own words, but even he wasn't sure if he believed them. This wasn't the dream home he had imagined when he placed that $5 bid. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that they had a place to call their own, something they could rebuild, something they could make into a home. Mark and Eli stepped out of the truck, their boots crunching on the gravel and dirt as they walked toward the cabin. The air smelled of damp wood and earth, a mix of decay and potential. The cabin was surrounded by thick brush and tall grass, the kind of place where no one had set foot for years. The silence of the woods pressed in on them, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. It felt like they had stepped into another world, one that had forgotten about time and the people who once lived there. Mark took a deep breath and forced his shoulders back. Let's take a look inside. The door creaked loudly as Mark turned the handle, the rusty hinges protesting with a high-pitched squeal. Inside, the cabin was just as bad as it looked from the outside. The walls were covered in layers of grime, and the floorboards groaned under his weight as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mold, and there were signs of pests everywhere. Holes in the walls, droppings in the corners. It was clear that no one had lived here for years. Eli stepped cautiously behind him, his eyes wide with curiosity. "It's kinda spooky in here," he whispered, his voice a mix of awe and apprehension. Mark chuckled nervously. "Yeah, it's a little rough around the edges. But that's all right. We've got work to do." They moved further into the room, and Mark couldn't help but feel a wave of despair wash over him. There was so much to fix, so many things broken and neglected. It was going to be harder than he thought, and they were so far from ready for this. But then Eli's voice broke through the haze of uncertainty. "Look, Dad, over here!" Mark turned to find his son kneeling near a pile of debris. Eli had pulled aside some old boards and uncovered something beneath them. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he crouched beside his son. Eli was holding an old, dusty wooden box. "What do you think it is?" he asked, his eyes wide with wonder. Mark hesitated, his fingers brushing the surface of the box. It looked ancient, like something from another time. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. Maybe this place held more than just the promise of a new home. Maybe it was a sign that, despite everything, something good could come from this decision. "I don't know, buddy," Mark said, his voice soft. "But let's take a look." He gently opened the box, revealing a collection of papers, yellowed and brittle with age. There were blueprints, hand-drawn sketches of machines Mark didn't recognize, and notes scribbled in a neat, precise handwriting. It was a strange sight, and Mark's heart began to race as he leafed through the papers. What was this? And why was it hidden here, in a cabin that seemed to have been abandoned for so long? Eli's voice pulled him back to the present. "What are these, Dad?" Mark shook his head slowly. "I'm not sure. But these don't look like just old papers. These might be something special." The box contained something far more valuable than they had bargained for. It was the beginning of something Mark couldn't yet understand, but he could feel it. It was a spark, a glimmer of hope in the middle of this run-down cabin, something that could change their lives forever. The first few days were harder than Mark had expected. The cabin was more of a ruin than a home, and every inch of it seemed to require attention. They had no electricity, no plumbing, and the pests were relentless. Mark and Eli spent hours cleaning out debris, sweeping away the years of dust and grime that had settled in every corner. They fought against the elements, patching up broken windows and trying to keep the rain from flooding the interior. It was a constant battle, one that felt more like survival than rebuilding. But despite the challenges, they kept at it. Every night, Mark would look at the progress they had made, small though it was, and feel a sense of pride. They had taken the first step. They had a place of their own, and slowly, with each passing day, the cabin began to take shape. The walls didn't look as grim, and the floors weren't quite as creaky. They built a fire in the old stone fireplace, the warmth filling the space with the smell of burning wood. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt a flicker of hope. I think we can do this. Dad, Eli said one evening as they sat around the fire, their faces glowing in the flickering light. Mark smiled, his heart swelling with pride. Yeah, buddy, I think we can. The cabin was slowly starting to feel more like a home. It wasn't much, just a roof over their heads and walls that didn't feel like they'd cave in at the slightest gust of wind. But it was theirs. Every evening, Mark and Eli sat in front of the fire, exhausted from a day of hard work, their bodies aching but their spirits lifted. There was a sense of satisfaction in the simple act of restoring something, of breathing life back into the old, forgotten structure. They were building a foundation, not just for themselves, but for a future that had seemed so distant just a few days ago. Yet, even with their progress, there was a lingering feeling that something was missing. Every corner of the cabin was filled with old furniture, broken down remnants of someone else's life, and there was still so much left to do. The cabin wasn't the home Mark had dreamed of, but it was a start. It was enough to give him hope. That morning, while Mark was working on the chimney, Eli's voice broke through the quiet hum of the cabin. Dad, come look at this. Mark put down the hammer and wiped his hands on his jeans before walking toward the sound of his son's voice. Eli was crouched down by the corner of the living room, his small hands gripping the edge of a weathered wooden plank. What is it? Mark asked, kneeling down beside him. The sunlight streamed through the cracks in the cabin, casting long shadows on the floor, but it was still too dim to see exactly what Eli had found. I think it's a trapdoor, Eli said, excitement lacing his words. He pulled at the edges of the plank, revealing a small, warped section of the floor. Mark's brow furrowed. A trapdoor? In a cabin this old? Eli nodded, determination in his voice. I think so. It looks like it's been covered up for a long time. Mark hesitated for a moment, unsure whether they should disturb anything hidden beneath the floorboards. They had already uncovered more than their fair share of debris and surprises. But there was something in Eli's eyes, an energy, a curiosity, that made Mark feel they were on the verge of something important. Well, go ahead, buddy, Mark said, stepping back. But be careful. We don't know what's down there. Eli nodded and, with an enthusiasm that only a 10-year-old could muster, worked at the plank with his hands, prying it loose with surprising strength. There was a creak of wood and a loud snap as the old nail came free. The trapdoor popped open, revealing a dark, hidden space beneath the cabin's floor. Mark's eyes widened. I'll be damned. The hole wasn't large, but it was deep enough to conceal something substantial. Eli reached into the opening, his small arm disappearing into the darkness. He pulled out something metal, something that had been hidden away for who knows how long. It's a box, Eli exclaimed, his voice full of awe. Mark took the box from his son, his fingers brushing over the cool metal surface. It was small, no bigger than a bread box, but its weight was solid, substantial. He couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for them, that it was meant to be found. A strange thrill ran through Mark's chest as he lifted it into the light. Where do you think this came from? Eli asked, his voice filled with wonder. I don't know, buddy, Mark said, his voice soft. But it looks like it's been down there a long time. Mark knelt down and carefully opened the box. Inside, there were a series of rolled-up blueprints, yellowed with age, along with several journals, their leather covers cracked and worn. The papers inside were covered in intricate drawings and diagrams, lines and shapes that seemed to make no sense to Mark at first glance. What the heck are these? Mark murmured, pulling one of the blueprints out and smoothing it flat. His eyes scanned the pages, taking in the delicate lines and markings that filled every inch of the paper. There were symbols and numbers that seemed foreign to him, and diagrams that made his head spin. Machines, pipes, gears. It was like nothing he had ever seen. Eli leaned over his shoulder. Are those machines? I think so, Mark said, his voice tinged with awe. But these aren't regular machines. These look advanced. Mark gingerly flipped through the journals, their pages brittle and delicate under his fingers. The handwriting was precise, detailed, like a man trying to capture the most intricate of thoughts. The more Mark read, the more the designs began to make sense, at least on some level. "These," Mark said, his voice a mix of disbelief and wonder. "These aren't just blueprints for regular machines. These are blueprints for energy systems. Sustainable energy systems. And I think these could change everything." Eli's face lit up with excitement. "What do you mean, Dad? What's so special about them?" Mark paused, his finger hovering over one of the drawings. It was a machine, small, compact, and efficient-looking. There were no external wires or fuel sources in sight. No pipes, no exhaust. Just clean lines and precision. "These machines," Mark said, his voice low. "They're designed to harness energy in ways I've never seen before. It looks like they could generate energy without using any fuel. Clean, limitless energy. These blueprints could be for devices that could change how the world produces energy." Eli's mouth dropped open. "You mean like free energy? Like forever?" Mark nodded, his mind racing. "Exactly. That's what it looks like. These devices could create energy with no waste, no emissions. Just pure, sustainable power." Eli didn't seem to fully grasp the scope of what that meant, but Mark could see the light in his eyes. It wasn't just a discovery. It was a promise. A chance for something more. For both of them. Mark stood up, the blueprints and journals still clutched tightly in his hands. He felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. He had always wanted a way out of their struggles, always dreamed of providing something better for Eli. But this was different. This wasn't just an opportunity to fix their broken lives. It was an opportunity to change the world. But with that opportunity came danger. If these blueprints were what they appeared to be, there were powerful forces out there that would stop at nothing to get their hands on them. Mark could already feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. He sat down on the old, worn-out chair by the fire, carefully unrolling another blueprint. The designs were so detailed, so precise, that it almost felt like they were meant for someone else. A man long gone, leaving behind a legacy for those who could see it. "This could be it, Eli," Mark said, his voice full of wonder. "This could be the key to everything we've been hoping for. A new life, a new future." Eli sat beside him, his eyes wide with excitement. "So, what do we do now?" Mark looked at the blueprints again, his mind already racing ahead to the possibilities. "We need to understand these, figure out how they work, and then we'll see where this takes us." The significance of the blueprints was clear. They were more than just a relic of the past. They were the foundation for a new future. Mark's heart pounded as he thought about the potential they held. These blueprints could change everything, not just for them, but for the world. But with that realization came a chilling thought. If these designs were as powerful as he thought, someone would come looking for them. And Mark had no idea just how far those people would go to get their hands on them. He stood up, pacing back and forth as he processed the information in front of him. This was no longer just about a father and son trying to survive. This was about something much bigger, something that could change the course of history. And suddenly Mark knew, whatever came next, he couldn't let it slip away. He had to protect these blueprints, protect their future, no matter the cost. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled upon something far bigger than just a series of blueprints. What had started as a desperate bid for a place to call home had turned into an adventure filled with unexpected turns. One that seemed to hold the potential to change the very fabric of the future. As the days went by, Mark and Eli spent hours poring over the journals and blueprints they had discovered, trying to make sense of the complex designs that filled the pages. But there was still so much they didn't understand. One evening, as the light in the cabin began to fade, Mark sat down with one of the journals, its pages brittle and fragile from age. The handwriting was neat but methodical, like someone recording a vision that they couldn't share with the world. Mark carefully turned the pages, reading the cryptic entries that described a series of high-tech energy systems, machines that could produce limitless, sustainable energy. But the deeper Mark went into the journal, the more questions arose. The entries spoke of government interest, of shadowy figures seeking to exploit Joseph Harper's work for purposes that weren't entirely clear. It was clear that Harper's inventions were far beyond anything the world had seen at the time, and someone, or something, had been intent on tracking him down. Mark's eyes scanned another entry, this one more personal. It spoke of Harper's growing fear as his inventions began to attract the attention of people who would stop at nothing to control them. The pressure is mounting. I feel it closing in around me. My work, my inventions, what I've created, is the future, and they know it. I must hide these designs. They cannot fall into the wrong hands. If I disappear, no one will know where to look. But if they find me, they will use my inventions for their own gain. This is the only way. Mark closed the journal, his mind racing. Joseph Harper, he muttered to himself. This is his work. And this is why he disappeared. Eli, sitting across the room, glanced up. What do you mean, Dad? Mark stood up, pacing the room. Harper didn't just vanish by choice, Eli. He knew what he had, what he'd created, and he knew that people would do anything to get their hands on it. The government, corporations, they all wanted control of his inventions. But Harper didn't trust them. He hid everything, leaving clues for someone who could protect his work. Mark's heart pounded as the pieces began to fall into place. Harper's disappearance wasn't some random event. It was the result of a calculated effort to disappear from a world that had already begun to circle like vultures. And now, Mark and Eli had unknowingly become the guardians of that legacy. But why here? Eli asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Why did he hide all this in the cabin? Mark stopped in his tracks and turned to face his son. I think it was the only place no one would think to look. This cabin was nothing. A rundown property, neglected and forgotten. But that's exactly why it was the perfect hiding spot. No one would expect someone like Joseph Harper to have hidden his life's work in a place like this. Eli nodded, his young mind processing the weight of their discovery. So, what do we do now, Dad? Mark rubbed his eyes, exhausted but resolute. We need to be careful. We need to understand this technology. We need to protect it. But we also need to find out more about Joseph Harper. Whoever was after him is still out there, and they'll come looking for these blueprints. We can't let them get their hands on it. For the next few days, Mark and Eli continued their investigation into the journals and blueprints, trying to piece together what Harper had been working on. They scoured every page, every note, and every diagram, but it became clear that the technology was far more advanced than anything Mark had ever seen before. The machines were capable of harnessing energy in ways that defied current scientific understanding. Some of the designs looked like something out of a science fiction novel. Devices that could generate power without relying on fossil fuels, without emissions, without waste. But as much as Mark was amazed by the possibilities, there was something that gnawed at him. He kept coming back to the journal entries, especially the ones where Harper spoke of his fear. Harper had been afraid, and rightly so. As the creator of something that could change the world, he had attracted the attention of people who would stop at nothing to take control of his work. It was only a matter of time before those people would come after Mark and Eli. It wasn't long before Mark's concerns started to materialize. It began with small things. Strange phone calls that Mark didn't remember making. The occasional rustling sound outside the cabin late at night. And the way the air seemed to feel heavier whenever he stepped outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. One afternoon, as he and Eli worked on repairing one of the cabin's windows, Mark noticed a car parked at the end of the dirt road. It wasn't an ordinary car. It was a sleek, black sedan, too nice for a rural area like this. And it wasn't a vehicle that anyone in town owned. Mark's heart skipped a beat as the car sat there, its engine idling but not moving. He tried to shake off the sense of unease that had settled in his chest, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that someone was observing them. His hand instinctively reached for the small, rusty wrench he had been using to tighten the screws on the window. It felt reassuring, like an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The car stayed for a few minutes, then suddenly drove off, kicking up dust as it sped down the road. Mark watched it disappear into the distance, his thoughts racing. Was it someone from the government? Or a corporate agent? Whoever it was, they had to be connected to Harper's work. Mark felt it deep in his bones. The next day, Mark and Eli were digging around the back of the cabin, clearing away the overgrown vines and weeds that had overtaken the property. They were focused on their task, but Mark's mind kept wandering back to the black sedan. What if someone had seen them? What if the discovery of the blueprints had already been reported? Eli, who had been gathering sticks for a fire, suddenly stopped and looked toward the woods. His eyes narrowed, and Mark followed his gaze. For a moment he saw nothing, but then he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. A figure, dressed in dark clothing, was standing among the trees, watching them. "Dad," Eli whispered, tugging at his arm. "There's someone out there." Mark's stomach twisted, and his hand instinctively went to the back of his waistband, where he kept the small knife he had brought with him. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was something. He slowly turned to Eli. "Get inside the cabin, now." Eli didn't hesitate. He bolted for the door, disappearing inside the safety of the house. Mark's eyes remained fixed on the figure in the trees, who had yet to move. It was as if they were waiting for something. Mark felt his heart thumping in his chest as he tried to steady his breath. Whoever this was, they weren't here by accident. As quickly as the figure appeared, it vanished into the woods. Mark stood motionless for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He had known this moment would come. He had known that they weren't just dealing with a discovery. They were sitting on something dangerous, something that could attract the wrong kind of attention. Mark's mind raced as he made his way back inside the cabin, locking the door behind him. He sat down with Eli, trying to hide the unease that had taken root in his chest. He couldn't explain the figure in the woods, nor the sense of urgency that had gripped him. But one thing was clear. The work of Joseph Harper was never meant to be found. And now, Mark and Eli were caught in the middle of a dangerous game. "Dad, what's going on?" Eli asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Who was that?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts still racing. "I don't know, buddy, but I'm afraid we've attracted some unwanted attention. Whoever is out there, they're looking for what we found." Eli's eyes widened in fear. "You mean the blueprints?" Mark nodded, his face grim. "Yes, and we need to be careful. This is just the beginning." The weight of their discovery had settled heavily on Mark's shoulders. Every day, as they worked on the cabin, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface. The journals, the blueprints, the mysterious reference to Joseph Harper's inventions. They were pieces to a puzzle he couldn't fully see yet. But with every new finding, he began to realize that what they had uncovered was no mere relic of a forgotten man. They were sitting on a treasure, something that could change the course of history. And every day, he felt the pressure mounting. Someone would come for it. Someone would come for them. That morning, as Mark and Eli worked to clear out some of the last remaining clutter in the cabin, they made another startling discovery. They were in the kitchen area, which had been a catch-all for random debris left behind by previous occupants. Mark was shoving old furniture out of the way when his foot struck something solid beneath a pile of broken boards. He bent down and cleared the debris, revealing a small, hidden door set into the floor. It wasn't much to look at, but Mark's heart skipped a beat. Another door? Another hidden compartment? "Eli," Mark called, his voice tight with excitement. "Come over here." Eli, ever the curious one, rushed over. He crouched down beside his father and followed his gaze to the small trapdoor, almost entirely concealed by years of neglect. "Another one?" Eli asked, his voice filled with wonder. Mark nodded, trying to suppress his growing excitement. "I think so." Together they pried the door open. It wasn't easy. Decades of grime had sealed it shut. But after a few moments of effort, the hinges creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into darkness. "Are you ready for this?" Mark asked, glancing at Eli. Eli gave him a wide grin. "I think so. Let's go." Mark led the way down the narrow staircase, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of dust and mildew, the musty smell of a space that had been sealed off for far too long. Eli followed closely behind, his eyes wide with excitement and uncertainty. At the bottom of the stairs, the small space opened into a hidden room, far larger than Mark had expected. The walls were lined with shelves, and in the far corner of the room was an array of strange-looking machines, some partially assembled, others covered with sheets of dust and tarps. The light from Mark's flashlight glinted off metal parts and unfamiliar devices. The entire space seemed to hum with a silent energy, like a place where time had stopped, but the potential to change everything still hung in the air. "What is this?" Eli whispered, his voice reverberating in the quiet space. "I think we've found Joseph Harper's workshop," Mark said, his voice thick with awe. "This is it. This is what he was hiding." Mark took a cautious step forward, scanning the room with growing disbelief. The machines before him weren't like anything he had ever seen. There were prototypes, devices that appeared to be energy generators of some kind. Some were sleek and compact, while others were bulky and complex. There were tubes, wires, and intricate panels that looked like something out of a futuristic laboratory. "What are they for?" Eli asked, unable to tear his eyes away from the machines. Mark stepped closer to one of the devices, running his fingers over the cool metal surface. It was like nothing he had ever encountered before, like a perfect blend of old-world craftsmanship and cutting-edge technology. He had no idea how any of it worked, but something told him this was the key to unlocking everything Joseph Harper had been working toward. "I'm not sure," Mark said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But these could be the very things that Harper was hiding. These machines, they're not just some mad scientist's fantasies. These are real, viable technologies. They could change everything." He turned to look at Eli, who was staring at a large machine in the center of the room. The machine was unlike anything Mark had ever seen. It had a large cylindrical core, surrounded by coils and wires, all encased in a sleek metallic frame. "Dad," Eli said, his voice breathless, "look at this." Mark followed his son's gaze and froze. There, in the center of the room, was a device that looked like a power generator, except it wasn't like any generator Mark had ever seen before. There were no wires feeding into it, no visible fuel sources. The machine stood there, inert, almost expectant. For a moment, Mark didn't know what to think. But then it hit him. This was it. This was Joseph Harper's magnum opus, the key to the energy revolution he had dreamed of. A machine capable of producing energy, clean, limitless energy, without the need for fuel. "It's a generator," Mark whispered, awe creeping into his voice. "But it's not just any generator. It's unlike anything we've ever seen." Mark's hands shook as he reached for the control panel beside the machine. The metal felt cold under his fingers, but there was a hum in the air, like the machine was alive, waiting for someone to unlock its potential. Mark had no idea how it worked, but somehow he felt a strange sense of trust in this machine, as if it had been built for him to discover. He pressed a series of buttons, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden jolt, the machine whirred to life. A soft blue light flickered on the display, and the room seemed to hum with an energy Mark couldn't explain. The sound was almost musical, a gentle whirring that gradually grew louder, like the hum of a distant engine coming to life. Mark stepped back, his heart racing. He couldn't believe it. He'd seen energy generators before, huge, cumbersome devices that required fuel, oil, and constant maintenance. But this was something else entirely. The machine was running on nothing but the air around it. No fuel, no emissions. Just pure energy, flowing freely through the coils. "Dad, it's working!" Eli shouted, his eyes wide with excitement. Mark stared at the machine, his disbelief turning into awe. "It's working," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's actually working." He took a step forward, watching as the machine continued to hum with power. It wasn't just a prototype anymore. It was proof that Harper's work had been more than just theoretical. The technology was real. And if this was possible, then anything was. This machine could change the world, and it was sitting right here in front of them. Mark stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. The machine had come to life before his eyes, and with it, the weight of its potential had settled on his shoulders. This was no longer just a discovery. It was a revolution. He ran his hand over his face, trying to collect his thoughts. The possibilities were endless. This machine could provide power for entire cities, entire countries, without the need for fossil fuels or electricity grids. It was the solution to the world's energy crisis, something that could eliminate dependence on oil, reduce carbon emissions, and bring clean, sustainable energy to everyone. But the reality of what they had uncovered was terrifying. This technology could change the world, but it could also destroy it. The people who would stop at nothing to control Harper's inventions weren't just looking for profit. They were looking for power. And Mark knew that if they discovered what he and Eli had found, they would stop at nothing to take it from them. Mark looked at Eli, who was still wide-eyed, staring at the machine in awe. For a moment, he saw not just his son, but the weight of the responsibility that had fallen on them both. They were no longer just a father and son trying to survive. They were the guardians of a future that could reshape the world. "We need to protect this, Eli," Mark said, his voice firm. "We need to figure out how to get this technology out there. But we also need to keep it safe. Because if we don't, someone will come for it. And they'll come for us." Eli nodded, his expression serious. "We can do it, Dad. We'll make sure it's safe." Mark's heart swelled with pride. "We're not just sitting on a property, Eli," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We've uncovered a life-changing technology, and now it's our job to make sure the world gets the chance to use it." As Mark looked at the machine before him, a new sense of purpose filled his chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about changing everything. And whatever it took, Mark would protect this discovery and the future it promised, no matter the cost. It had been weeks since Mark and Eli first uncovered Joseph Harper's hidden laboratory. Each day had brought new challenges and new discoveries, slowly refining their understanding of the groundbreaking technology that had been hidden away in the cabin. The machine was still humming quietly in the corner of the workshop, a steady reminder that what they had found was not just a relic of the past, but a key to the future. They had spent countless hours trying to make sense of the blueprints, deciphering the intricate designs, and learning about the various energy devices Harper had left behind. The progress was steady, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. Every morning he woke with the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. They weren't just building something for themselves anymore. They were sitting on the cusp of a global breakthrough. And the closer they came to understanding the technology, the more the shadows seemed to lengthen around them. Mark had made a decision. He couldn't keep this hidden forever. The technology needed to be shared with the world. It needed to be developed and used to solve the global energy crisis. The idea of creating a sustainable, limitless energy source was the dream of every scientist, every environmentalist, every person who had ever felt the sting of pollution and resource depletion. But with that knowledge came the terrible realization. The wrong people would stop at nothing to control it. That's when they came. Mark had been working late that night, reviewing the latest set of blueprints when he heard the knock. It was light at first, tentative, as if the visitor wasn't sure whether anyone was home. He looked toward the door, his heart pounding. Who could it be? His first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend he wasn't home. They had been trying to keep a low profile, but something about this felt different. His gut twisted. Another knock, louder this time, followed by the sound of a voice. "Mr. Reynolds?" It was a man's voice, calm, authoritative. "We know you're in there. We'd like to talk to you." Mark's breath caught in his throat. His immediate reaction was to look toward Eli, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, drawing sketches of the energy machines they had been studying. Eli's eyes met his, wide with confusion and concern. Mark stood up quickly, his pulse quickening. "Stay inside, Eli. Don't open the door." Eli didn't protest. He simply nodded, his expression anxious. But Mark could tell his son was just as scared as he was. Mark wasn't sure who was standing outside, but he had a sinking feeling that this was no casual visitor. The way they knew his name, it didn't feel right. Mark moved toward the door, peeking through the small crack in the curtain. He saw two figures standing in the twilight. Two men, dressed in dark suits, their faces partially obscured by the shadows. They weren't just here for a friendly chat. He hesitated. His mind raced. If these men were government agents, it could mean trouble. Mark knew they had uncovered something powerful, something that could change the world. But he hadn't yet figured out how to protect it, or how to share it without risking everything. Mark opened the door cautiously, his hand resting on the knob, ready to close it if necessary. The two men outside stood tall and confident. One of them, a middle-aged man with dark hair and glasses, smiled politely, while the other, taller, with a cold, unreadable expression, waited silently. "Mr. Reynolds," the man with glasses said smoothly, "we're from the Department of Energy. We've been following your progress on some very unusual energy systems. We believe you've uncovered something of great importance. May we come inside?" Mark's heart raced. He didn't invite them in. Instead, he took a step back and spoke cautiously. "I'm not sure I understand what you're talking about. What do you mean, following my progress?" The man's smile didn't waver. "We've been keeping an eye on developments in clean energy research, Mr. Reynolds. We have reason to believe that you have something of tremendous value, something that could change the course of global energy production." Mark swallowed hard, his hand tightening on the door. He could feel his pulse pounding in his throat. "I don't know what you're implying. I'm just trying to fix up an old cabin." The agent raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "We understand, Mr. Reynolds, but we know about Joseph Harper's work. We know what you've discovered, and we believe that it would be in everyone's best interest if you allowed us to help." "Help?" Mark's voice tightened with suspicion. "How exactly would you help?" The agent's tone shifted, becoming more businesslike. "We would like to purchase the technology you've uncovered. We have the resources to develop it further, to integrate it into national energy systems. We can offer you a large sum of money for your work, Mr. Reynolds, enough to provide for you and your son for the rest of your lives." Mark's mind reeled. A large sum of money? That sounded appealing, didn't it? The weight of his financial struggles had been crushing for months, no, for years. And the thought of being free from it all, of being able to provide for Eli without worry, was tempting. But deep down, he knew there was more to this than just money. He wasn't sure what exactly, but something in the man's voice, something in his cold, calculating eyes, told Mark that the offer wasn't as simple as it seemed. He glanced over his shoulder at Eli, who was standing quietly in the corner, watching him with wide eyes. Mark's heart ached. He had always promised Eli that he would do whatever it took to make their lives better. But could he trust these men? Could he trust the government to handle Joseph Harper's legacy with the integrity it deserved? "I don't know," Mark said slowly, his voice unsure. "This isn't just about money. This technology, it's bigger than us. It could change everything. If we sell it, what happens to it? What happens to the people who need it?" The agent smiled again, but there was no warmth in his expression. "Mr. Reynolds, we understand your concerns. But the reality is that this technology is too important to be left in the hands of just anyone. We have the infrastructure to develop it properly, safely. Think of the impact it could have on the country's energy systems, on national security. This is about the greater good." Mark's stomach churned. The words were smooth, polished, but something about them didn't sit right with him. The greater good sounded too much like the justification of someone who wasn't concerned about the world's future, only their own control over it. "I'm not sure I can just hand over something like this," Mark said, his voice growing firm. "This could be a breakthrough for clean energy. The whole world could benefit from it, not just one country, one government. The agent's smile faltered for a moment, then returned, colder than before. "Mr. Reynolds, you misunderstand. This technology is too powerful to be left in the hands of civilians. You can't possibly comprehend the scale of what you've found. It's not just about providing energy, it's about controlling it. And if you refuse to cooperate, we will have no choice but to take further action. You and your son would be, well, safer with us." Mark's heart stopped. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. He felt his grip on the door tighten. These weren't just government agents. They were operatives, sent to secure something that had the potential to change the world. Mark took a deep breath. "You don't understand," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm not selling. I'm not giving this to anyone. If you think you can just take it—" "We'll be back," the agent interrupted, his tone turning icy. "You'll reconsider, Mr. Reynolds. In time." The two agents turned without another word, retreating into the shadows as quickly as they had come. Mark stood frozen in the doorway, his mind racing. He had just been offered a deal that could solve every financial problem he and Eli would ever face. But the cost of that deal was too high. If he handed over the technology, it would be suppressed, twisted, controlled for the benefit of a few. And Mark couldn't let that happen, not when the world had a chance to use it for good. Inside the cabin, Mark paced back and forth, his mind reeling. The agent's visit had shaken him to his core. They had made their intentions clear. They wanted control, and they weren't above using force to get it. But the money, the financial security, it was so tempting. Mark had never imagined a future free from financial worry. The thought of never having to choose between groceries and rent again. It was a powerful lure. But the weight of the decision pressed down on him. Selling the technology would mean losing control. It would mean watching the potential for a better world slip away into the hands of those who cared only for power. Mark couldn't live with that. And what about Eli? He was just a boy, too young to understand the full implications of what was happening, but old enough to feel the tension in the air. Mark couldn't risk their future being dictated by forces that didn't have their best interests at heart. The dilemma was crushing. He was torn between the immediate relief of financial security and the long-term responsibility of protecting Joseph Harper's legacy and the world's future. He had to make a choice, and that choice could cost him everything. Mark stood at the cabin's window, his gaze fixed on the barren stretch of land that lay ahead. The evening light stretched long across the property, casting an orange hue over the trees and the dilapidated cabin that had started to feel like home. But now, everything had changed. He wasn't just fighting for a place to live anymore. He was fighting for a future. A future that could either be controlled and exploited by powerful forces or shared with the world to bring real, sustainable change. The encounter with the government agents earlier that day had been a wake-up call. They had made their intentions clear. They wanted the technology. They wanted control. Mark could sense the underlying threat behind their smooth words. The money they had offered was enough to secure his and Eli's future. A comfortable life free from worry. But at what cost? Was he really willing to hand over something so powerful to be hidden away, suppressed for the benefit of a few? Something that could change the energy landscape forever? He couldn't. Not after everything he had learned. Not after seeing the potential of Joseph Harper's work firsthand. Mark exhaled slowly, his thoughts heavy. It wasn't just about money. It was about the legacy of a man who had dreamed of something better, something more sustainable for the world. A man who had risked everything to create a future of clean, limitless energy. Mark couldn't just sell that away, not when there was still a chance to change the world for the better. Mark turned away from the window and walked across the room to where Eli sat, sketching more of the blueprints he had found hidden in the cabin. The lines on the paper were a clear reflection of Eli's sharp mind, drawing out ideas and machines that could reshape the future. Mark looked at his son, who had been by his side through everything, his quiet support a constant reminder of why they had to get this right. "Eli," Mark said, his voice steady but resolute. "We need to talk." Eli looked up from his drawing, his dark eyes reflecting concern. "What's wrong, Dad?" I'm not going to sell the technology, Mark said, the words feeling like a weight lifted from his chest. I'm not going to hand it over to them. Eli's expression softened. You mean the government people? Mark nodded. Yes, they came today. They offered us a lot of money, enough to fix everything, to give us a life without worry. But we can't take it. This technology, it's bigger than us. It's bigger than money. It's the key to something that could change the world. Eli's eyes shone with something Mark had seen in him before. A quiet determination. I get it, Dad. You think it should be used for good. For everyone. That's right, Mark said, his voice firm. We can't let this be buried or controlled. We need to take it to the world and share it. Do it the right way. Eli stood up and walked over to his father, looking up at him with admiration. We can make it work, Dad. We can develop it ourselves. We can help people. Mark smiled down at his son, feeling a swell of pride. The weight of the decision was still there, but it no longer felt so heavy. Eli understood. They were in this together, and together, they would make sure Joseph Harper's dream didn't die in a hidden laboratory. We can do it, Mark agreed, more confident now. We'll take this to the world on our terms, and we'll make sure it's used the way it was meant to be used. For good. The next morning, after a sleepless night filled with restless thoughts, Mark sat at the small kitchen table, Eli beside him. They had talked through their decision again and again, weighing the risks, considering every possible outcome. It was clear to both of them that this wasn't just a decision about what was right for them. It was a decision about the future of the world. Mark picked up the phone and dialed the number he had been given by the government agents. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the receiver to his ear, but his resolve was stronger than the fear gnawing at him. The phone rang twice before the same voice answered, smooth and polite, just like it had been earlier. Mr. Reynolds, the agent said, I trust you've had time to think about our offer. I've thought about it, Mark replied, his voice firm. And I've made my decision. I'm not selling. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then the agent's voice came back, colder now. Mr. Reynolds, I think you misunderstand the situation. We're offering you a lot of money, a lot of security. Think about your son. You can walk away from all your problems today. No more stress, no more struggles. I'm not selling, Mark repeated, his voice unwavering. This technology isn't just mine to sell. It belongs to the world, and I'm going to make sure it gets into the right hands. The agent sighed, a sound of frustration more than anything else. This is not a negotiation, Mr. Reynolds. You need to understand the implications of your decision. There are forces at play here that you don't fully comprehend. If you choose this path, you'll have to deal with the consequences. Mark's jaw tightened. I understand perfectly, and I'm willing to deal with whatever comes. But I'm not letting you take control of something that could change everything. The line went silent for a long moment, and when the agent spoke again, his voice was colder than ever. You'll regret this, Mr. Reynolds. We'll be in touch. Mark hung up the phone and turned to Eli, who was watching him intently. They're not going to give up easily, Mark said, his voice low. Eli nodded, his face serious but determined. We're not giving up either, right, Dad? Right, Mark said, smiling. We've made our choice, and now we stick to it. Mark and Eli spent the next several days mapping out their plan. They had to be strategic. The technology was powerful, yes, but it was also complex. The world wasn't ready for something like this, not yet. They would need to refine the machines, make them workable for mass production, and figure out how to distribute them without drawing too much attention. Mark knew they couldn't take the world by storm overnight, but if they were careful, they could lay the foundation for a new kind of energy revolution, one that was open, ethical, and shared by all. We'll start small, Mark said, pacing in the cabin's living room as he spoke to Eli. We'll test the technology, refine it, and then we'll look for the right people to partner with. Scientists, engineers, people who believe in this the way we do. We can't do it alone, but we can build a team. Eli nodded, his mind already working. We'll need a place to test everything, somewhere safe, away from the government's reach. And we'll need to build up a network. People who will help spread the word. Mark stopped pacing and looked at his son. Exactly. And once we're ready, we'll start talking to the world. Introduce the technology in a way that can't be ignored. We'll need to be careful about who we trust. We can't let it fall into the wrong hands. Eli grinned. I'm in, Dad. We'll make it work. Mark smiled back at his son, his heart swelling with pride. This was it. This was their mission now. To protect Joseph Harper's legacy and share his work with the world. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be without risks, but they had made their choice. They had chosen to fight for a better future, not just for themselves, but for everyone. They had a long road ahead, and it wouldn't be without challenges. But for the first time in a long while, Mark felt a sense of hope and purpose. The decision was final. They would protect this technology, and together, they would bring it to the world, on their terms. And as they moved forward, Mark knew one thing for certain. They were no longer just two people in a rundown cabin. They were the beginning of something much bigger. Mark stood at the edge of the cabin's porch, staring out at the land they had started to make their own. The early morning mist hung low over the trees, giving the landscape an almost ethereal quality. For the first time in months, the weight of the world didn't feel so heavy. The cabin that had once seemed like nothing more than a desperate gamble had become something far more than that. It had become a place of hope, a place of change. Behind him, the sounds of Eli's laughter echoed through the cabin. His son had already set to work on a new set of blueprints, refining some of the designs they had found in Joseph Harper's journals. Eli's natural curiosity and sharp mind had been key to everything they'd done so far, and Mark had no doubt that his son would play a major role in the future of this technology. Mark couldn't help but feel proud of what they had built so far. But as they continued to refine Joseph's inventions, the reality of their mission became clearer. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were trying to change the world. The decision to keep Joseph Harper's technology safe and share it with the world had been an easy one. But the work that followed was anything but simple. Mark and Eli were still just two people, and the enormity of the task ahead felt overwhelming at times. They couldn't do it alone, not if they wanted to see the technology grow, evolve, and reach the people who needed it most. It wasn't long before they began reaching out to trusted engineers and scientists, people who understood the gravity of what they had discovered. At first, it was just a few calls, some tentative emails, and quiet conversations. But slowly, word began to spread about the discoveries being made in the small, remote cabin in the woods. And as the news spread, more and more people reached out. One of the first people to respond was Dr. Claire Williams, a renowned engineer who had worked in renewable energy for over 20 years. She was the kind of person Mark knew they needed, someone who understood the scientific and ethical implications of the technology, and who could help guide them as they refined the prototypes. When Dr. Williams arrived at the cabin, she was visibly impressed. Mark had given her only a glimpse of the technology over the phone, but seeing it in person was a whole different experience. The machines, which had once seemed so foreign to him, were now something he could explain, something that could be turned into a working reality. This, Dr. Williams said, looking over the energy generator that had been their first breakthrough. This is incredible. It's unlike anything I've seen. But it's only the beginning. There's so much more potential here. We need to scale this, and we need to do it quickly. Mark's heart swelled with excitement. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't alone in his belief that this technology could change everything. Dr. Williams, along with a handful of other engineers and scientists who joined their effort over the next few weeks, began to work tirelessly alongside Mark and Eli to refine the devices. The cabin, once a symbol of their desperation, had transformed into a small, bustling center of innovation. There were whiteboards covered in equations and diagrams, workstations full of tools and spare parts, and long days and nights spent testing prototypes, tweaking designs, and working to make the energy generators more efficient. They didn't have the luxury of a large lab or endless funding. Everything they did was on their own terms, in the confines of the cabin and its surrounding workshop. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were building something that had the potential to change everything. Mark's thoughts often drifted back to that pivotal moment when he had rejected the government's offer. The money, the security. That was before he had known what could be done with the technology. But now, as he worked with these brilliant minds, he realized how right his decision had been. They weren't just fixing the cabin. They were building the future. "We're not just fixing this cabin," Mark said to Dr. Williams one evening as they were reviewing a set of new energy tests. "We're building something that could change the world." Dr. Williams looked at him, her face serious. "You're right. But we're also building it for the right reasons. This isn't about profit. This is about humanity." Mark nodded, feeling a surge of purpose. It wasn't about making money. It was about giving the world something it so desperately needed. Clean, limitless energy. And that was something worth fighting for. As the work continued, their small, isolated team began to grow. Word of their efforts spread further within the scientific and environmental communities, and soon, Mark and Eli were receiving support from unexpected places. One of their first allies came in the form of Maya Chen, an environmental activist who had spent years advocating for renewable energy and sustainable development. She had heard about their project through a colleague at a green energy think tank and immediately reached out, offering both her expertise and her platform to help spread the word. "I've seen a lot of promises over the years," Maya said when she first met Mark and Eli at the cabin. "But nothing like this. What you're doing here, this could be the turning point. The world needs this." Her enthusiasm was contagious, and with Maya's help, they were able to start organizing a larger network of supporters. People who believed in the vision of clean energy, but also understood the importance of making sure it was developed ethically. They also began to receive attention from tech innovators who saw the potential in Joseph Harper's designs. One of the first was Gavin Lee, a young entrepreneur with a background in sustainable tech. He was the kind of person who had the technical knowledge, the funding sources, and the drive to turn Joseph's machines into something that could be mass-produced. "Look," Gavin said, his eyes lighting up as he reviewed the plans for the energy generator. "This is exactly what we need to change the world. I've been looking for a breakthrough like this my entire career. If we can scale this technology, we could revolutionize the global energy market, and do it responsibly." With Gavin's connections and Maya's advocacy, Mark and Eli were able to start discussing partnerships and funding options that aligned with their vision. They weren't just interested in making money. They wanted to make sure the technology was used for the good of all people. They were already in contact with several nonprofits, energy cooperatives, and independent engineers who had expressed interest in working with them. Mark knew they were still far from where they wanted to be. They hadn't yet figured out the logistics of mass production, or how they would reach the communities in need. But the momentum was building, and every new ally they gained brought them closer to their goal. As they continued to make progress, Mark found himself reflecting more and more on the path that had brought them here. There were times, during the long nights of working through complicated designs, when he had wondered if they were doing the right thing. But with each new breakthrough, with each person who offered their help and their belief in the project, he knew that they were on the right track. This wasn't just a dream, it was a mission. In the evenings, after the team had gone home for the night and the cabin was quiet, Mark and Eli would sit together, their heads buried in blueprints, discussing ideas and future possibilities. Eli had grown so much in such a short time. He was no longer just a boy playing with drawings. He was an integral part of this mission, a partner in every sense of the word. "What if," Eli said one night, looking up from his notebook, "what if we could make the technology portable? What if we could bring it to people in remote villages, places where they don't have access to power?" Mark looked at his son, pride swelling in his chest. "I think that's a brilliant idea, Eli. We'll need to figure out how to scale it for that. But it's exactly what we need to be thinking about. It's not just about providing power to cities. It's about giving people everywhere the chance to live better, cleaner lives." As Mark sat back in his chair, staring at the small flickering light from the energy generator they had been testing, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They were still a long way from reaching the goal of providing sustainable energy to the world. But for the first time in years, the future felt full of possibility. Mark had made the right choice, and together with Eli, their team of trusted allies, and the growing network of supporters. They were building something that could change the world. Something that would have a lasting impact long after they were gone. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the land. Mark and Eli sat together on the front porch of their now restored cabin. The same cabin that had once felt like nothing more than a crumbling ruin. A last-ditch gamble. Now, as they looked out over the sprawling landscape, the cabin had become something entirely different. It wasn't just their home anymore. It was the foundation of a revolution. Mark leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the arms, and took a deep breath. The air had a crispness to it, the kind that only came with the promise of something new. There was no longer a sense of desperation hanging over him. The weight he had carried for so long, the uncertainty of the future, had been replaced by purpose. They had done it. They had taken something that seemed impossible and turned it into something real. They had taken Joseph Harper's work and, together with the help of their growing team of engineers, activists, and innovators, they had built something that could change the world. A clean energy system that could provide limitless power without the environmental destruction of traditional energy sources. The cabin, once bought for just $5, had become the headquarters of their new foundation. A foundation dedicated to developing and distributing sustainable energy technologies to those who needed it most. The journey had been long, filled with obstacles and challenges. But as Mark sat there beside Eli, looking out over the land they had worked so hard to restore, he felt a deep sense of pride. "We've come a long way, haven't we, Dad?" Eli said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet awe. Mark smiled, glancing at his son. Eli was no longer the young boy who had looked up at him with wide eyes, wondering when they would have a real home. He had grown into a young man who understood the weight of their mission. Eli had become not just his son, but his partner. Someone who was just as determined to make a difference as Mark was. "We sure have, buddy," Mark replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We've built something here, and we're not just surviving anymore, we're thriving. We're making a difference." Eli nodded, looking out at the horizon. "I never imagined something like this could come from a cabin that cost $5. It's kind of hard to believe, honestly." "It doesn't feel real, does it?" Mark said, his voice soft. "But it is real. Everything we've done, every step we've taken, has led us to this point. And it's only just beginning." Mark's thoughts drifted back to the man whose work had set everything in motion. Joseph Harper. It seemed like a lifetime ago when they had first discovered the hidden laboratory beneath the cabin. The blueprints, the journals, the machines that had looked like science fiction had all been part of a legacy Harper had left behind. A legacy of hope for a cleaner, more sustainable future. When they first began reading Harper's journals, Mark had been struck by the passion and determination in the man's words. Harper had known the dangers of his work, the risks of having it fall into the wrong hands. But he had also known the potential for good, how the energy systems he had created could change the world. Now, as Mark sat there with Eli, he realized that Harper's vision had not been in vain. It had found its way into their hands, and together, they were going to make sure it didn't fall into obscurity. Harper's work had been buried for too long, hidden away in a small cabin in the woods, waiting for someone to unlock its potential. Mark and Eli had done that, and now it was their responsibility to make sure the world knew about it. "I wish we could have met him," Eli said softly, breaking Mark from his thoughts. "Joseph Harper, I mean." Mark nodded, his eyes distant. "I do too. I think he would have been proud of what we've done with his work. But even if we can't thank him in person, we can make sure his legacy lives on. That's the most important thing." Eli looked up at his father, his eyes filled with determination. "We're going to make sure of that, right?" "We are," Mark said firmly. "We're going to take this technology and use it for good, for the world. We're going to make sure that Joseph Harper's dream doesn't die. It's our mission now." Mark leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The journey had been long, but every hardship had led them to this point. The cabin that had once been a symbol of their struggle, of their desperation, had transformed into something far more powerful. A place of innovation, hope, and purpose. But the work was far from over. The technology they had uncovered still needed refining, and the logistics of bringing it to the world were complex. Mark and Eli knew they had a long road ahead of them, filled with uncertainty and obstacles. But they also knew they were no longer alone in this mission. The team they had assembled, scientists, engineers, environmental activists, and entrepreneurs, were all working toward the same goal. They were all driven by the same vision. A future where clean, sustainable energy wasn't just a luxury for the privileged few, but a resource available to everyone. "We're not just fixing this cabin," Mark said, his voice full of conviction. "We're building something that can change the world. It's not just about us anymore. It's about everyone." Eli nodded, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "We're not just making energy, we're making a difference." Mark smiled at his son, feeling a swell of pride in his chest. Eli had grown so much throughout this journey. He had become more than just a witness to the unfolding story. He had become a leader in his own right, someone who understood the importance of their mission and who was willing to take on the responsibility of shaping the future. As the sun continued to set, casting a fiery orange glow across the sky, Eli reflected on how much had changed since that first day they had set foot in the cabin. It felt like a lifetime ago, a time when their biggest concern had been finding a place to live. Now, looking at the life they had built together, Eli realized how much he had learned. He was no longer just a boy looking for a home. He was a part of something much bigger, something that could change the world. When they had first discovered Joseph Harper's work, Eli had been filled with excitement and curiosity. It had all seemed like a dream, an adventure, almost too wild to believe. But as the weeks and months had passed, the dream had become a reality. They had brought the technology to life, and they had already started planning how to share it with the world. Eli had always looked up to his dad, but now, as they sat together on the porch, he saw the weight of responsibility in his father's eyes. Mark had made countless sacrifices, had fought through so many challenges, all for the future of their family and for the future of the world. Eli realized that his father's mission was his mission now too. They had become partners in something far greater than they had ever imagined. "I get it now, Dad," Eli said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. "This isn't just about energy. It's about changing how the world works. It's about making sure everyone has the chance to live better." Mark turned to him, his expression softening. "Exactly, Eli. We've been given a gift. Joseph Harper's gift, and now it's our job to make sure it's used the way it was meant to be used." Eli's gaze turned back to the horizon, where the sun had finally dipped below the trees. The sky was painted with streaks of pink and gold, and for a moment, everything felt still, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. "We're going to do it, Dad," Eli said confidently. "We're going to change the world." Mark placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a proud smile crossing his face. Together. As they sat there, watching the last light of the day fade into night, Mark knew that their journey was just beginning. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, and they would face opposition from those who sought to control the technology for their own gain. But Mark and Eli had already made their decision. They had chosen to fight for a better future. A future where clean energy could power the world without destroying it. The cabin had been a symbol of their struggle, but now, it was a symbol of their victory. And as Mark sat beside Eli, he knew one thing for certain. They were no longer just surviving, they were thriving, and together, they would change the world. If this story touched you, make sure you're subscribed because I've saved something extra special for you tomorrow.